Today's feast can seem a bit odd for those of us who live here in the United States. That the history of our nation is one where we threw off an oppressive king, where we do not like the idea of someone ruling over us simply because they were born into a particular family. Yet our nation has always had a difficult relationship with kings. We don't like someone else ruling over us, but we didn't entirely throw away the idea of the king. We still refer to the man as being the king of his castle. We call our daughters princesses. We refer to the wife as queen. Our fascination with royalty is so much that even a few years ago, here in the U.S., there were more people watching the royal wedding in the U.K. than people watching it over in Britain. Our stories, our fantasies often portray a king as a villain, someone who has let power corrupt him. And even the very history of today's feast can seem a bit at odds with society. That this is actually a relatively recent feast. It was not until the close of the First World War that the Pope decided to institute this feast day. That as nations the world over were abolishing monarchies and transferring to democracies, the Pope established the feast of the solemnity of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the universe. Part of this ambivalence comes from the fact that throughout history, we have seen that kings can be horrible tyrants. It doesn't take long to look through a list and see kings who oppress their people, who saw the rulership, the crown, as merely for their own benefit, their own personal gain. In the words of Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. But we can also look at history and see examples of good kings. Our very own parish, St. Louis, is named after a king of France. And it is these kings that actually showed forth what the term means, what it is we are to understand when we speak of a king, and why it is we refer to Jesus Christ as our Lord and King. Once again, to use a negative example, there's a famous painting of the coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French. That he had called the Pope from Rome, in fact, actually had taken him prisoner and hauled him into Paris, and at Notre Dame was going to have the Pope crown him as the emperor. That there was a long tradition of kings and emperors being crowned by popes and bishops, as a way of saying that the authority they have is not of their own, but is from God. A reminder to the king that he is to be a steward. But in this painting, it paints the scene right after Napoleon took the crown for himself, pushing the Pope off to the side and placing the crown upon his own head. That this very symbolic gesture was Napoleon's way of saying his authority is his own, he will do with it as he pleases. He is not answerable to God or any other person. And so in this painting you see the Pope off in the corner looking dejected, and Napoleon standing triumphant, asserting his own authority. As I said, this is the negative example. That the very thing that Napoleon was rejecting in his coronation was the very idea of what a king is. That the king is the one that God has appointed as his steward and representative. This isn't to say the king can do whatever he wants because he has God's authority, but rather quite the opposite. That he is to follow the example of God himself. Throughout history, we see our kings and find trapping in elegant places, very much lavish and enjoying the benefits of royalty. But our King Jesus Christ paints a different picture. Rather than being in a far-off palace, away from the concerns of people and his subjects, a king is called to identify with the weakest within his realm. That St. Louis, King of the French, is a saint is because he understood this. In his letters to his son on how to rule, how to be a good king, St. Louis is always reminding his son that he is, as the king, he is the servant of his subjects, that he is called to care for those whom God has placed under him, that the reason the king has all this wealth is not for his own benefit, but to be spent in the good of the people. The king is to identify with the poor and the oppressed. In today's gospel, Jesus gives us a parable for the final judgment, but it's not quite a parable. It's more a statement of fact. That at the end of time, the king will come and take up his place on the throne, and all will be called before him to give an account of their lives, of how well they served the king, how well they understood what the rule and authority meant. And we hear Jesus saying, we hear the king speaking to his subjects, and the standard of evaluation is how they treated the weakest amongst them. That as easy as it can be to look at the king in his fine robes and his crown and his glory and his luxurious palace, Jesus is instead calling us to see the king in the poor, the oppressed, the homeless, those whom the world accounts as nothing. These are the people that the king identifies with. These are his subjects to whom he is most concerned. And so we, as the followers, should likewise be concerned with those same people. In his rule of life for monks, St. Benedict wrote that all the monks are to try to see Christ in others. That when a visitor comes to the monastery and knocks, the porter, the one who answers the door, is to greet that individual, no matter what their condition is, as if they were Christ in front of them. That when we celebrate this feast of Christ the King, in many ways, it's a turning over of what the world often presents as kingship. The king is not the one who is better than everyone else, to whom his subjects must serve to make his life easy, but rather the king is the one who is to be identified with the poor and the weakest. That he is to seek to serve those who have been cast out by society. As we hear in the first reading, the king is to be a shepherd, and any shepherd knows that your bigger concern is the sheep who are weak, the sheep who need feeding, the sheep who need to grow. When we celebrate this feast of Christ the King, and what the Pope was after when he instituted this feast was not saying that the civil governments of kingship shouldn't be abolished, but rather all people should recognize what leadership means. That authority of any kind is from God. That those who rule over others, those who are more fortunate than others, must follow the example of Jesus Christ, who is our King, that although he is God, creator of the universe, that everything in heaven and on earth is his, he set aside his divinity. He became a human being like you and I and walked amongst the outcast, the poorest, the weakest within his realm, to give them strength, to build them up, to call them into a relationship with God. That we who serve this King must do likewise, must follow his example and seek to find Christ present in those around us. That when we encounter the poor, the homeless, the needy, we are not to see someone who is asking for a handout, someone who is a nuisance to society or a bother to us. But instead, we are to see our King asking us to help him, asking us to serve him. That the greatest power on earth identifies with the weakest. As we hear time and again in our superhero movies and in society, those with authority have a responsibility to the weakest. And so you and I, as Christians, must also live out this example, seeking to serve the weakest amongst us, seeking to find Christ in the hungry, the poor, and the outcast. That when we come to our final judgment and stand before the King, he will say to us, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world."